Kevin Costner not being one of them, Kevin being a good guy. There were other people involved with that were not good guys to me. Once I said, hey, how about if we do this and that? Maybe we could do some things together.
For years, Hollywood has always loved a villain. And for much of his career, the villain of choice in industry gossip was Val Kilmer. Difficult, demanding, impossible. Those were the words that followed him from set to set, attached to his name in trade publications, and passed around in hushed conversations at studio meetings. For years, two very different versions of Val Kilmer existed at the same time. The one on screen, who could make you forget you were watching performance, and the one behind the camera who left a trail of strained relationships and frustrated directors. Then in January 2024, Kurt Russell sat down with GQ and, with the kind of bluntness that comes from someone who has nothing to prove and no agenda to manage, told a very different story about the man. It was not a story about a monster. It was a story about a friendship. And after Val Kilmer died on April 1st, 2025, at the age of 65, that interview took on a weight that neither man could have fully anticipated when it was recorded. To understand what Russell was pushing back against, you have to understand where Kilmer's reputation came from, because it did not come from nowhere. Val Edward Kilmer was born on December 31st, 1959, in Los Angeles, California, and from his earliest years as a performer, he operated with an intensity that most people around him found difficult to calibrate. At 17, he became the youngest student ever accepted into Juilliard's drama division at the time, an institution built on the belief that great acting required total commitment, and Kilmer absorbed that lesson completely. He turned down a role in Francis Ford Coppola's The Outsiders to honor a prior theater commitment, which tells you something about where his priorities were even at the beginning. By the time he broke into film with the 1984 spy spoof Top Secret and followed it with Real Genius the following year, he was already someone who did not just learn lines, but inhabited roles at a cellular level. That level of commitment produced performances that critics and audiences found remarkable. His turn as Jim Morrison in The Doors in 1991 required him to wear leather pants continuously throughout the production, insisted that cast and crew refer to him only as Jim Morrison, and spent an entire year immersing himself in the music and the mythology of the man. To play Doc Holliday's piano scene in Tombstone, Kilmer, who did not know how to play the instrument, spent months practicing Chopin's Nocturne in E minor so that the performance would be authentic. For the character's final scenes depicting death by tuberculosis, he reportedly filled his bed with ice to physically replicate the sensation. This was not an actor coasting. This was someone who understood that the difference between performance and a transformation was the total elimination of the gap between himself and the character he was playing. But that same ferocity had a cost, and the industry cataloged it meticulously. Director John Frankenheimer, who took over the chaotic production of The Island of Dr. Moreau in 1996, told journalists afterward that there were two things he would never do again in his life: climb Mount Everest and work with Val Kilmer. Joel Schumacher, who directed him in Batman Forever in 1995, publicly called him childish and impossible, and Kilmer was not asked back for the sequel that followed. In 1996, Entertainment Weekly ran a cover story with the headline, "The Man Hollywood Loves to Hate," which captured the mood of the industry toward him at the peak of his commercial success. Co-star Michael Biehn, who appeared alongside Kilmer in Tombstone, once said in an interview that he had worked with Val Kilmer but had never actually met him, because the only person he ever encountered on that set was Doc Holliday. It was meant as an observation about Kilmer's method, but it also carried a genuine note of bewilderment at the distance his immersion created between himself and the people working around him. Kilmer, for his part, never fully denied the reputation. He acknowledged in later years that he had behaved in ways that alienated people, but he framed it consistently in terms of artistic standards rather than personal malice. He once noted that his reputation for being difficult only applied to working with people he considered inadequate. He said late in his life that he had behaved poorly, had behaved bravely, and had behaved bizarrely, and that he denied none of it and had no regrets. That is not the statement of someone who was unaware of how he was perceived. It is the statement of someone who made a calculated choice to prioritize the work above the comfort of the people around him, and who understood the price that came with it, which is exactly what makes Kurt Russell's account so striking. Because the Tombstone that Russell and Kilmer made together in 1993 was not a smooth production by any measure. The film began with Kevin Jarre, who also wrote the screenplay, in the director's chair. Jar lasted roughly a month before being replaced by George Cosmatos, the director responsible for Rambo, First Blood Part 2, who came in with almost no preparation time and was, by multiple accounts, working from shot lists that Russell had compiled the previous night. Russell has since confirmed in interviews that he was deeply involved in the creative direction of the film, working out the visual approach each evening, while serving simultaneously as the lead actor on set during the day. He deliberately did not take a formal director's credit, but the people who were there understood clearly enough where the creative decisions were coming from. The production was held together by his sheer determination to not let it fail, and it was Val Kilmer who watched all that happen in real time from the seat directly across from him on set. What developed between them in that pressure cooker was not conflict. It was something rarer on a troubled Hollywood production. Genuine alignment. When Russell spoke to GQ in January 2024, he said the working relationship with Kilmer was characterized above all by trust, not by careful management, not by professional tolerance, by trust. He said the two of them were always in cahoots, always thinking the same thing, always moving toward the same creative destination from slightly different angles. He called their collaboration a wonderful thing to have, and said that when he looked back on what Kilmer did with the role of Doc Holliday, he considered it one of the finest performances of Kilmer's career. Coming from someone who has shared screens with some of the most celebrated actors of the past 50 years, that is not a casual observation. That is a considered judgment from someone who was physically present every day for the making of one of the most beloved westerns in American cinema. Kilmer himself had gone on record about the experience years earlier, in a blog post he wrote in 2017 when the perennial question of who actually directed Tombstone resurfaced. He was not vague about it. He wrote that Kurt Russell was solely responsible for the film's success, with no qualification attached. He described watching Russell sacrifice his own creative energy as a performer to serve the film as a whole, working through the night on logistics and storytelling, while simultaneously carrying the lead role during the day. He wrote that Russell put his money where his mouth was in a way that very few stars ever extend themselves for a cast and crew. He also made a point of clarifying that Cosmatos did direct the film, that the credit was not fraudulent, but that the creative engine behind what appeared on screen was unmistakably Russell. Kilmer even noted that the two of them worked so intensely during production that he eventually moved into Russell's home and slept on the sofa during the periods when Goldie Hawn was not in town, so they could use every available minute on preparation without losing time to travel. That is the kind of collaboration that goes well beyond professional respect. And then there is the story of the gifts, which is a detail that no one who hears it ever quite forgets. Russell explained in the GQ interview that in his era of filmmaking it was not unusual, though never required, for actors to exchange gifts at the end of a long and demanding production, something to mark the experience and acknowledge what they had built together. After Tombstone wrapped, Russell put together a gift for Kilmer that was rooted entirely in character logic. He gathered photographs of Kilmer's props from the film, the holster, the gun, the hat, and the chair with Kilmer's name stenciled on the back. He had them assembled into a keepsake. And then, working from the understanding that Doc Holliday was a man defined by his proximity to death, a dying tuberculosis patient who had nothing left to lose, and who drew his extraordinary fearlessness entirely from that fact, Russell bought Val Kilmer a burial plot at Boot Hill Graveyard in Tombstone, Arizona, the actual historic cemetery where many of the legendary figures of the Old West were laid to rest. What Russell did not know, because there had been no coordination and no discussion, was that Kilmer had independently reached for the exact same symbolic contrast. Kilmer's gift to Russell was an acre of land overlooking Boot Hill. Not in it, above it, the living man's view, Russell played Wyatt Earp, a man defined by survival, by the relentless pursuit of life against the forces trying to end it. Kilmer played Doc Holliday, a man staring death in the face, so directly that he had made peace with it, without a single conversation about it. Without any coordination, the two of them had each independently expressed their friendship to the same opposing metaphor, death and the view above it, the grave and the land that overlooks it. Russell said in the GQ interview that the synchronicity of that moment, discovering what they had each done entirely on their own, told him more about what they had built together than almost anything else could have. Two people so genuinely tuned to the same frequency that they expressed themselves through the same image without exchanging a single word about it. Russell also spoke to Rolling Stone after Kilmer's death, sharing something he had never previously made public. 3 years before Kilmer died, Russell had visited him at his home for what turned out to be the last time. Kilmer's health had been deteriorating for years by then. He had been diagnosed with throat cancer in 2015 and had undergone 2 tracheotomies and chemotherapy, treatments that had permanently damaged his vocal cords and required him to use an electric voice box to speak. The cancer had eventually gone into remission, but the treatments had left lasting physical consequences. When Russell sat with him in those final years, Kilmer looked at him and said, with a laugh, that sometimes he could have been a little bit nicer to a lot of people. He was being retrospective, Russell noted, looking back on a life with honesty and without self-pity, and still finding a way to laugh at the truth of it. Russell told Rolling Stone that he was a good guy, that everybody had their full 360 degrees of their person, and that if anyone deserved to rest in peace, it would be Val. Kilmer died on April 1st, 2025, at Ronald Reagan UCLA Medical Center in Los Angeles. His daughter Mercedes confirmed the news to the New York Times. The official death certificate listed pneumonia as the primary cause, with contributing factors including acute respiratory failure, chronic respiratory failure, the long-term effects of his squamous cell carcinoma treatment, malnutrition, and a tracheocutaneous fistula. He was 65 years old. He had been scheduled to appear at the Beverly Hills Film Festival on the day he died. The tributes came from across the industry. Tom Cruise held a moment of silence at CinemaCon and said he wished Kilmer well on his next journey. Michael Mann, who directed him in Heat in 1995, spoke about always marveling at the brilliant variability within the powerful current of Kilmer's way of possessing and expressing a character. Francis Ford Coppola, Cher, and countless others paid their respects publicly. And almost immediately, the GQ interview from January 2024 resurfaced and began circulating everywhere. People who had never seen it started sharing it because suddenly it was not simply a career retrospective. It was a portrait of a friendship. It was Kurt Russell, already on the record, already having said everything that mattered about the man he had worked alongside in the Arizona desert 3 decades earlier, before either of them knew how little time remained. The popular narrative about Val Kilmer had always been built around the complaints of directors who found him impossible to manage. What Russell gave the world, in an interview recorded more than a year before Kilmer's death, was the other side of the ledger. What it actually looked like when Val Kilmer found a collaborator who operated on the same wavelength he did, who trusted him rather than trying to contain him, and who understood that the intensity that made him difficult on some productions was exactly the same intensity that made a performance as Doc Holliday something very few actors would ever come close to. Touching. That is the truth Kurt Russell revealed. Not a scandal. Not a rehabilitation project. Just an honest account of friendship between 2 professionals who understood each other completely, expressed it through matching gifts on opposite sides of cemetery, and never needed to explain it to anyone else.